Welcome, everyone. It's really good to have you all with us. I'm so excited. I see 94 people are joining us already. Welcome.
Wow. Super. So yeah, we'd like to welcome you all and joining us in this webinar, Hearing the Cries of the Amazon. This is the first of two webinars recognizing the 50th anniversary of Earth Day and the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. My name is Anne-Marie Brennan. With Nancy Lawrence, Kevin Turf, and Angelica Gonzalez-Apple, we represent the co-sponsors of this webinar, Christian Life Community, Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement, Church of St. Francis Xavier in New York City, with the support from Global Catholic Climate Movement. We're really honored today to present two important defenders of the Amazon, Mauricio Lopez Oropeza and Maria Luisa Mendonça. We begin with an opening prayer. Draw us forth, God of all creation. Draw us forward and away from limited certainty into the immense world of your love. Give us the peace to live with uncertainty, with questions, with doubts. Help us to experience the resurrection anew, with open wonder and the ability to see you in all the people of Easter. So in recent months, the whole world has been shaken with the coronavirus pandemic. That this is impacting the lives of people all around the globe makes us even more aware of our interconnectedness and the home that we share in common, our planet Earth. These are the themes that have been lifted up by Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si. The pandemic is also highlighting those communities that are facing alarming vulnerability, suffering, inequality, and injustice. This past week, we observed the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which was instituted to mobilize awareness and action for environmental protections. Identifying protections needed for the whole world is surely a daunting task and responsibility. So this webinar, we take a look at a particular part of the world, that of the Amazon region. The Amazon region is an environmentally lush geographic area. It contains the world's largest tropical rainforest and an abundance of biodiversity. The rainforest acts as a key climate regulator, producing 20% of the world's oxygen and acting as carbon sink. However, this critically important ecosystem for our planet is facing severe threats from human activity in the form of deforestation, from logging, fires, mining, and other extractive industries, corporate agricultural practices, and more. The indigenous communities are at particular risk as their land is unjustly appropriated, upending their way of life, subjecting them to displacement, poverty, violence, and even death. Today, we are privileged to have two speakers with us who have direct experience of the peoples in the Amazon region. They will present their observations, insights, and efforts to address and improve the conditions in the Amazon. The two speakers are Mauricio Lopez, who works for REPAM of the Pan-Amazon Catholic Church Network, and Luisa Mendonça, who founded the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights, based in Brazil. After their presentations, there will be time for Q&A. We encourage you to post your questions in the chat box, and our co-host Kevin Turf will facilitate directing your questions to our speakers. We will also post a list of actions on what you can do to help support protection of the people's land and biodiversity in the Amazon. We plan to conclude our program around 5:15. So we'll introduce our first speaker. Here, yeah. So Mauricio is Executive Secretary of REPAM, which is a Catholic Church network that promotes the rights and dignities of people living in the Amazon region. Mauricio played a lead role in the preparation for and during the Synod on the Amazon last October in Rome. He was appointed to the Pre-Synod Council of Bishops and was an auditor at the Synod. He worked for Caritas Ecuador for a number of years and is also a committed member of Christian Life Community, which is an international Ignatian lay association for which he served as world president from 2013 to 2018. This is during this time that I got to work with Mauricio and discover his deep faith and spirituality, and which really is the basis for his passion and compassion and the accompaniment and support of the peoples in the Amazon. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce Mauricio Lopez.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. I'd like to thank all of you for the opportunity to be here today. So these days are very difficult days in the Amazon, but for the whole world. This call from the Pope as to recognize how we are all interconnected invites us to a different type of response. So I just want you to take a few seconds to contemplate these hands and experience, even though we are facing a very difficult time, the hands of God, the hands of the spiritual forces sustaining us, holding us, and being certain that there will be a tomorrow. And I also invite you to not only focus on the Amazon as a territory, that one that's probably too far away from you, but your own Amazon, those places, those peoples, those mysteries that are also endangered and call for your response, that call for our response. And in this moment, I'd like to take a moment also to remember the 12,000 people that are officially affected by the pandemic in the Pan-Amazon region, and close to 700 deaths. We cannot rely on those numbers. Certainly, it is much worse than that, but these are the numbers that we have officially, and it is really, really worrying what's happening there. So it is a moment in which we need to put our trust in God and also connect with the spiritualities of the peoples there as to try to respond and come out of this together, and hopefully in a better perspective for a horizon. I'd like to start with this quote from Teilhard de Chardin, which I think is crucial for this understanding of our connection with the Amazon these days. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. This changes everything. It is the whole being, our whole identity changing towards a perspective of belonging to a larger reality. It is not about our achievements today, but rather the connection with one another, the connection with nature, and the connection with God. And this, the indigenous peoples in the Amazon know very well about, and they want to also offer us that kind of wisdom. And this is probably one of the centerpieces of the Synod and the Amazon, bringing the voices, bringing the stories, bringing their spiritualities, not as a threatening presence, but also as an enriching, actually as an enriching experience of dialoguing with one another. So this phrase, I think, is also very, very challenging these days. It comes from the sacred book of the Mayas in the southern part of Mexico. But I think it applies to all of us and to the Amazon. They took our fruits, they cut our branches, they burned our trunks, but they could not kill our roots. Right now, in this moment, many of those situations continue to happen. Fruits taken away, territories, lives taken away, burning of trunks, the burning of the Amazon itself. The roots of the peoples there continue to stand and resist. And they're calling for all of us, not only the Catholic Church or the organizations working with them, but to the whole world. There is some scientific data that actually explains that this situation that we're going through is probably caused by the loss of the ecosystems, especially in the Amazon, but all over the world, and the losing of the equilibrium, the losing of the balance of our planet. So I think it's an important moment to feel the call to respond together. So I'll stop sharing my screen just to continue with this invitation of recognizing that the greatest structural challenge that we are facing today, the biggest ecological challenge, is called throwaway culture. What we're going through these days is a result of a decision of our human societies, at least those somehow ruling on how we relate with one another, and this exploitation process, which has produced a huge inequality. We have lost the balance. The indigenous peoples in the Amazon continue to tell us that the reason for us to be experiencing this today is the fact that we have lost the balance. It is not possible to maintain this type of development or so-called development if we continue to destroy our ecosystems. And this is actually happening these days. The type of inequality is actually the one producing this impossible pathway that we are going through. In these days, we have a number which is really, really obscene of about 8 families in the world, only 8 families concentrating half of the whole of the riches of the planet. And also we know that 1% of the population of the planet concentrates 85% of all of the riches of the planet. There is no way to continue like this. The planet cannot continue like this, and the Amazon is being crushed by this type of thinking. And what we felt, it was this peripheral thinking, somehow discardable, or a secondary type of thinking or wisdom coming from the indigenous communities, knowing they are not perfect, of course. They are just as human as we are. But they offer a different type of wisdom, which can help us to find a new balance in the world. And in this pandemic, we see how important it is to find the right balance. Otherwise, we will be facing just another type of pandemic. And this is the climate emergency, which is already there. It's right there. So the peoples in the Amazon and the response that we can offer as to keep it, to protect it, to also embrace the wisdom of the people might give us a chance to find different perspectives. And it is not only the Amazon. The Amazon is just a concrete face, but it's also connected with the other Amazons in the planet. Look around you, the places close to you, the situations that are happening in Dakota, for example, in the United States, in the Congo Basin, in the Asia Pacific forests, in Central America. It's happening all over the place. Those forests, the indigenous people living there, their wisdom and the possibility for us to protect that is under threat all over the place. So perhaps this pandemic, a very, very sorrowful pandemic, which is impacting directly right now to the indigenous peoples in the Amazon, could also be an opportunity, as I said before, to stand up and resist. The Amazon region is almost as big as all the United States. It has 7.5 million square kilometers. It's huge, it's immense, but it's also connected with us in so many ways. The water we drink, 20% of the water that humans can consume that is not frozen in the planet, 20% comes from the Amazon. I always say, think about it as in terms of having 1 out of 5 glasses of water that you drink every day, you owe it to the Amazon. This fragile system is also producing that. But not only that, the diversity we have there, flora, fauna, and excluding the oceans, which are the biggest producers of oxygen, the Amazon region is also a major player in the production of oxygen and the balance for the whole planet. So we are connected with it. And it is not an empty space. There are 33 million people living there, out of which 3 million are coming and members of indigenous communities, 400 different nationalities of peoples. And at the same time, we have different cultures, languages, experiences of life, which offer us a different perspective. For those of us who are members of the Catholic Church, believers, when we say a preferential option for the poor, we also make a preferential option for the possibility for a better future. It is not about saving anybody. It is about recognizing the riches, the wisdom, the capacity, the different spiritualities as to dialogue with our own. Remember Teilhard de Chardin, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. We are responsible for one another. And in this moment, we are also responsible for the Amazon region and its people. So this is how we enter into this church experience, the Synod, which is a convention and a process in which the Pope listens to the people as to offer responses and actions from the church for a concrete reality, for an urgent call for the whole church. It was for the first time ever that a universal synod was focused not on a region, but rather on a territory. And the discussions there were not only about the Amazon, were all about Laudato Si, the integral ecology, the balance of the planet, and other regions in the planet as those that I have already mentioned, like the Congo Basin, the Asia Pacific tropical forest, the Central American biological corridor, so on and so forth. So in this sense, I want to also share with you some extract of the document from the Pope, which is an invitation for all of us right here. The Amazon region is a multinational and interconnected whole, a great biome shared by 9 countries: Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Peru, Suriname, Venezuela, and the territory of French Guiana. Yet, I am addressing the present exhortation to the whole world. I am doing so to help awaken the affection and concern for that land which is also ours, and to invite all of the world to value it and acknowledge it as a sacred mystery. Please pay attention to this word, a sacred mystery. Lots of attacks and lots of rejections to the Amazon Synod were on the basis of taking the sacredness of the church and putting it in something that is not. The Pope himself is telling us the territory, the people there, the beauty of it, and the threats that this territory is going through is also a reflection of a sacred mystery. It does not substitute our faith and our center part of our identity as Christians, but it rather connects the following and the building of the kingdom to that acknowledgement of the sacredness of this mystery. And also the church needs to be concerned about the problems of this area. And it calls to a discussion, however, which is also important for other areas of the world. So the other part that I want to read from the document is everything that the church has to offer must become incarnate in a distinctive way in each part of the world, so that the church can take on a variety of faces that better manifest the inexhaustible riches of God's grace. Preaching must become incarnate. Spirituality must become incarnate. Ecclesial structures must become incarnate. This synod has opened possibilities for new pathways, which have been part of the dynamic of the church. But in these days, we really need to take a stand. And I was called to also try to offer some concrete pathways. So 3 of them come from the direct personal experience. The first one, a word that comes from our own tradition, metanoia, a radical conversion of the heart. I can tell you and give you all of the scientific facts from the Amazon, bring the indigenous peoples themselves to talk to you about their reality. If there is not an inner transformation, nothing will ever change. The Pope can offer a new encyclical, following up on Laudato Si. You need to understand what is your call and your own transformation, which needs to happen in your concrete reality. And this is probably the core invitation of this synod, which was not meant only for the Amazon, but that started responding to this reality, a peripheral reality coming to the center. But it all comes down to this. Are you ready? Are we ready? Am I ready to that radical conversion? A radical and truthful conversion of the heart. I need to start by changing. And I think this pandemic and the sorrowful experience which it brings is really also an opportunity for that radical transformation of the heart. The second element is the otherness, alterity, alteridad, the otherness, which calls for the recognition that I can only understand the mystery of life by looking at other people's eyes, by encountering the other. And this is the only way in which I can experience also the salvation process and the presence of God. So in this sense, we also have a challenge from the indigenous peoples, from Pope Francis, from reality. Can we also acknowledge our sister Mother Earth as another? Can we really embrace her as this counterpart? We are part of it. We are not saying that it is more important and becoming an animist community. We are recognizing that we come from it and we go back to it, and we need to find a balance. And calling it Sister Mother Earth is not some new age experience, but it comes from our own tradition. Saint Francis of Assisi has been calling it like that 800 years ago. So we need to understand this alterity is also in recognition of the other, the different, indigenous communities and their wisdom, their spirituality, not as a threat, but something that can complete our understanding and our response, but also Sister Mother Earth and its fragility as that other that calls to our attention and for a concrete response. And the third one, the word is paresia, the courage to speak out, the courage to act, the courage to change our patterns and come out and respond to the reality in which I am. We are not capable of going to the Amazon, all of us. It is about recognizing what is your concrete Amazon around you? Where is the integral ecology appeal right around you? How can you also impact positively or negatively to the reality of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon with the way you consume, with the vision of development that you have? The change is also about coming out, transforming reality, advocating for others. We were supposed to be in New York these days at the UN Indigenous Peoples Forum with leaders from the Amazon, as we've been doing for the past years, advocating with them, accompanying them in their own process of standing up and talking about what's happening in the realities. We couldn't do it, so we are happy to offer you as REPAM some concrete possible pathways of responding to the reality, but it starts with you in your concrete place. So I finish with the 4 conversions that the Pope is calling the whole world to experience. And they are drawn from the territorial experience of the Amazon and its peoples. A pastoral conversion. The church needs to change. It needs to change the structures that no longer respond to the urgent cries of the crucified Jesus right there in the reality. We should not be afraid. We will maintain everything that's provided light and possibility, but we also have to undergo a process of changing whatever that doesn't help us respond to the crucified faces of Jesus and the hopeful faces of resurrection out there. The second, a cultural conversion, embracing the identity of the indigenous peoples or other cultures, not as a threat, and not only embracing an enculturated approach, but an intercultural approach. The spiritualities of the peoples, their knowledge in terms of protecting Mother Earth, in terms of how they relate to one another, even though they're not perfect, they show us that it's possible to find a proper balance. And us from Western societies, we can see immediately with what's happening these days that we have failed. This throwaway culture cannot continue. How can we learn from them, work together, and embrace a pathway in which we can respond to this climate crisis? The third one is the ecological conversion, which is clearly stated in Laudato Si, and it comes from understanding what's happening and all the way to acting from our faith, but with others of good faith to change the reality. And the final one, it's a synodal conversion. We can only achieve this by walking together. Synod, by definition, means walking together. We need to find the right rhythm, the right way of walking with one another, but that's the only way we can go about it. I'm very hopeful for this type of spaces, people like yourselves committed in different places, because now the pandemic is a sign of an urgent call to walk together, to connect a synodal church, a synodal society, which can embrace the urgent cries like the Amazon, but also the global response that we so very much need. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. I really, your passion is very apparent. Those connections between this pandemic and the exploitation of the ecosystem, recognition of the wisdom of the indigenous and helping us find balance now, and the conversion that's really needed on those various levels is something that I think is helpful for us in how we can move forward with this. I do want to give you an extra shout out to you and to your wife, Ana Lucia, as you celebrate your anniversary today. So I think this is a demonstration of your passion, again, of helping and getting the word out, speaking with Mauricio for the indigenous on such a special occasion. So thank you to Ana Lucia for allowing me to be present with us today. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Maria Luisa Mendonça. She's a researcher at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is a founder and co-director of the Brazilian Human Rights Organization, Network for Social Justice and Human Rights, and she's the editor of the annual report, Human Rights in Brazil. Maria Luisa holds a PhD in human geography from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Her 2018 book, Political Economy of Agribusiness, demonstrates the central role of the food system in international relations. And her current research is on financial markets and land speculation, especially in the global South. With much delight and interest, we welcome Dr. Maria Luisa Mendonça.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to share this moment with all of you. And I would like to start talking about the situation in Brazil to give you a perspective of what is happening with indigenous communities in Brazil and a very serious crisis that we have now, especially because we have a government, the Bolsonaro government, that is giving incentives to the destruction of the Amazon and repression against rural and indigenous communities in Brazil. These communities are in the forefront of resisting to defend life on the planet. So we're not talking about people who are far away, a situation that is far away from us. Like Mauricio was saying, you know, we are all connected, and it's very important to connect all these dots. And we need to build international solidarity. In the case of Brazil, of course, you know, the Amazon is not just Brazil, but I'm gonna focus a little bit more on Brazil. And what we have now is a very dangerous combination of rhetoric and also actions by the Brazilian government that is giving incentives, for example, to open up indigenous lands for mining, also promoting the expansion of soy monocropping in the Amazon, you know, the expansion of agribusiness in the Amazon, which is a main cause of climate change and a main cause of the destruction of biodiversity. Also, the Bolsonaro government put military personnel in key positions of power, especially in relation to the agencies that work with indigenous people, which of course goes against, you know, the interests. And the indigenous movements in Brazil now are seeing with the additional threat of coronavirus that they're talking about a possible genocide. So we need international solidarity so these communities can protect themselves. And of course, that there is a lot that the international community can do to, you know, one, to give visibility and denounce human rights violations against indigenous communities, and human rights defenders in Brazil. You know, dozens of indigenous leaders have been killed since Bolsonaro took office. And also what we have been seeing is displacement of these communities, destruction of the land, which also, all of these actions also have an impact on urban areas, because if people in rural areas are displaced from their land, then that causes migration to urban areas and all the problems of poverty, inequality that we see in large urban areas in Brazil and in other countries as well. So as Mauricio mentioned, this is not empty land. You know, we usually, the government, you know, sells the idea that in Brazil we have all this amount of empty land available, but this is not true. You know, thousands and thousands of rural communities live there, small peasants, indigenous communities that have been living in the land for many, many generations. So, and also that is also a key role that international corporations play, because most of the agribusiness corporations, mining corporations are multinational. So that is something that we can also do from other countries. For example, agribusiness, which is a main cause of climate change and the destruction of the Amazon, you know, there is this idea of we need to choose between so-called development and protecting the Amazon. But, you know, what they call development, for example, the expansion of agribusiness, this is not development. We need to call what it is, which is destruction. Because in order to have a productive agricultural system, we need to protect the soil, we need to protect biodiversity, water sources. So when you allow the expansion, for example, of those large plantations that they don't produce food. This is not about the production of food. It's about the production of mainly 4 commodities for export, which is beef, soy, sugar, and timber, which, you know, is not what most people eat. So the majority of the food for internal markets that people consume locally is produced by small farmers, not by large agribusiness that also are dependent on inputs, chemical inputs that are based on fossil fuels. So that's why agribusiness is a main cause of climate change. So one of the things that the indigenous movements in Brazil are calling for is that we pressure multinational corporations and Congress members here in trade agreements to boycott those 4 commodities from Brazil, beef, timber, sugar, and soy, because this is a main cause of the expansion of the destruction of the Amazon and the fires that we saw that continue actually, you know, now that many people are paying attention to the crisis of the coronavirus, which is another tragedy for indigenous people in Brazil. A lot of people are getting, you know, of course, we need to pay attention to that as well. But in the meantime, the destruction continues. We see illegal logging and land grabbing against rural communities. And another key aspect is the role of financial corporations, pension funds, and banks from the US, but also from Canada and Europe, because after the collapse of the housing market here in the US, a lot of those multinational corporations, financial corporations, started to migrate and target farmland around the world. And Brazil is a main region where there has been land speculation. So large financial corporations are buying land and displacing rural communities as well. And that is also happening in the Cerrado, which is the savanna region of Brazil, which is a key area in terms of biodiversity and water sources. Is where many of the main rivers in Brazil start. And it's like an upside down forest because the trees are relatively short, but the roots go on and on and on for many kilometers. So it's another key area in terms of groundwater sources. And the expansion of plantations in that area cause huge environmental degradation and destruction of many river springs, and also it pushes the agricultural frontier more to the north. So it gives incentives to the destruction of the Amazon. So these two regions are connected, the Brazilian savanna, the Cerrado, and the Amazon as well. For example, when we talk about the Green New Deal here in the US, there are some proposals that say that we need to limit foreign ownership of land in the US, of farmland. But we also need to look at the role of US corporations or foreign corporations in other countries as well. So when we, this is a point in which we can do advocacy work in the US, calling Congress members to look at the new Green Deal from an international perspective. Because, for example, the destruction of the Cerrado and the Amazon changed the rainy season, not only in Brazil, but in the whole hemisphere. So they form what we call, the forest forms what we call flying rivers. So when we destroy the forest, we change the raining cycles, and you create severe drought in the southern part of the hemisphere and in the northern part of the hemisphere as well. And now, we already have seen dramatic changes in climate and rain cycles. So again, all of this is connected. And I think that with the crisis, the public health crisis with coronavirus, there are two things that are also important to remember. One is that many scientists are saying now that the virus is a result of the destruction of biodiversity. So it's a public health crisis that also is very much connected to environmental destruction. And second is that, so far we don't have a treatment for coronavirus. So what the best thing we can do to protect ourselves is to take care of our immune system. And how do we do that? We do that with healthy foods, right? So we need to protect small farmers that work on an ecological way, agroecology. And in the US and Europe, I think there is more awareness about the need to support small farmers, ecological agriculture, local farmers. But in the global south, the model that is being implemented is still the large plantation model based on fossil fuels, the industrial agriculture model. And that is the main cause of climate change. So we need to build solidarity to give support to small farmers in other countries as well that produce healthy foods at an accessible price. Because the only reason the agribusiness model survives is because they receive most of the subsidies from our government. So we can also advocate so governmental subsidies can go to small farmers in subsistence agriculture as well, because indigenous communities, small farmers that produce for subsistence are also invisible in the economic data, but they are responsible for the survival of millions of people that live in rural areas, and also to provide healthy food at an accessible price to urban communities as well. So I think that we can also look at the recent UN reports, especially the ones that look at the problem of destruction of biodiversity. And it's clear that indigenous communities are the main protectors of biodiversity. And so it's very important that we protect them and we provide support and solidarity for these communities. So thank you so much for interest and for your support.
So thank you so much, Maria Luisa. I think it's really helpful to get some of those insights into the running of the agribusiness and the impact it has on the indigenous. So both Mauricio and Maria, there's a lot here to think about. I see our chat box has already included so many questions. So I'm going to turn this portion over now to Kevin Turf, and he'll navigate through the chat and the questions, as well as talk about some of the recommendations for action. So Kevin, you just let me know when you want to talk about those actions, and I can put up that slide. Thank you.
First of all, thank you all very much for being here. My name is Kevin Turf. I'm a representative of the Church of St. Francis Xavier Environment Ministry in New York City. And I want to thank our wonderful speakers who joined us today. And Mauricio, perhaps you can come back online. I'm going to have my first question for you. And if you have a question, please do go to the chat box and indicate if your question is for Mauricio or Maria Luisa. Mauricio, my first question for you, thank you for all that you are doing, number one, and congratulations on the success of the Synod. My question is regarding what many of us finally, the Amazon came on the radar last year when we saw the massive wildfires. Could you speak to how much devastation, how much destruction that caused? And then I also know there were news stories that some of these fires were in fact not naturally causing, and that there was a lot of purposeful violence against indigenous people related to that. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly, Kevin, thank you so much. So I think it's very important to know that it is part of the dry seasons in the Amazon region and the places around that you usually have some bushfires, forest fires, but the difference, and also the winds during those seasons also expand this situation, but what changed, and this is not only Brazil's case, and I'm sure that Maria Luisa can also tell us a little bit more about that, but it was also other places in which, for us, there was a criminal intention promoted by the governments themselves, who are supposed to protect the reservations and the natural reserves, and also the indigenous lands. They were the ones changing the policies as to facilitate the possibility to expand the production for agribusiness, as it was already put by Maria Luisa. So it is very important to say, and this has no ideological stand, because this was happening in a very similar way in Brazil with Bolsonaro, under Bolsonaro, but it was happening something similar with Bolivia, while Evo Morales was still there. It was a different dimension, of course, but in Bolivia, the policies were changed in a very similar way to promote and facilitate the expansion of the agribusiness because of the need to sell the commodities to the international trade and the markets. So we have to understand that this is the result of dependence and some type of inequality in the global system with our Latin American countries, but at the same time, big major chains of corruption, regardless of your ideology, which are somehow making it easier for those destroying the Amazon and the surrounding areas to do so. So it is a very, very serious situation. And as you mentioned, the violence against indigenous or community leaders all throughout the Amazon. This is the same, especially if you see Brazil situations, the situation is getting worse because they're taking out, dismantling the structures of the government to respond. The FUNAI, which is supposed to respond to the reality of the indigenous people, is being dismantled, or the people in charge with some type of understanding and respect for the reality and identity of the indigenous people is being changed by other people. It was in recent days somebody who has this very ancient view of these missionaries, of especially evangelicals, forcing the connection with the indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation, and with the speech and the justification of saving them in this pandemic, which actually puts them under a bigger threat. So we haven't talked about that. We have about 400 different indigenous nationalities in the Pan-Amazon region, but also we have more than 130 indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation or not contacted, which are the most vulnerable, and they have a whole different life system, and they are also under threat. This pandemic, if you see the immunological system, they have no way to respond to the reality today. And others that are also more connected, like the Yanomami people in the Amazon, they've already been affected by the miners, the illegal miners or illegal miners entering their territories. So violence is increasing, and deforestation rates increased more than ever in the past year. But during the quarantine, in the pandemic, the numbers are also increasing. That means that governments and some of the specific initiatives continue to work and expand their activities while there is no protection whatsoever. So it is a very difficult time. I will just finish by saying we as RECAM have been working with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We produced a report, an official report, which is somehow legal jurisdiction or legal, its jurisprudence for the region in terms of the Pan-Amazon region, the indigenous peoples, and in which this church, the Catholic Church, has been playing a major role. But I am just sad to say it is a very small portion of the Catholic Church understanding this type of commitment and this work with the poor, with the excluded, and the intercultural approach. A big number of the Catholics were supporting this, in my view, criminal government as the one of Bolsonaro or others similar in other places.
Thank you. Maria Luisa, you spoke about the challenges in Brazil. What has been the result of the Synod? How has it been received in Brazil, especially by leaders of the government? And do you see, does the result of the Synod, does it give any leverage for you to go to the United Nations, to go to work with any other governments?
Yes, Pope Francis has been very close. He developed a close relationship with social movements in Brazil, with landless workers movement, the MST, with indigenous communities, and he has played an important role in also defending democracy in Brazil. He met with former President Lula recently, when Lula was out of jail, because it's important to understand that the reason Bolsonaro is in power is because we had a parliamentary coup against President Dilma, and you know, she was impeached, although there was no proof of a crime against her, and also former President Lula was put in jail, although there is no evidence against him. So there was this political vacuum created because of the parliamentary coup. And now we see this, you know, far-right extreme government of Bolsonaro, which is a huge threat to democracy and to human rights in Brazil. So And Pope Francis has played a key role to defend human rights in Brazil and has a close relationship with social movements. So this initiative of protecting the Amazon is very important because that gives this topic much more visibility. So it's a very important initiative. And just to complement the previous question, there was a video that was released after the fires showing that it was called, a group of loggers and, illegal loggers, miners in the Amazon. They promoted what they call the Day of Fire in the Amazon. So there was, a plan to start the fires, because even though it was the dry season, there was more rain this year, last year, than the previous year. So we cannot explain why there was so much, the fires increased so much, even though there was more rain during that time. So, it's clear that there is actually evidence that it was actually criminal fires.
Right. There's a question from a person asking, is there a list of agribusiness companies that individuals or churches, especially in the US, that people could reach out to complain, to take action, to protest? Is there anything like that?
Well, there is the 4 big ones internationally. We call the ABCD, right? The ADM, Bunge, Cargill, which are US-based companies, and also Dreyfus, which is a French company. Also Monsanto, it's key because it produces a lot of the chemical inputs, and GMOs, which is also a huge threat to biodiversity. And in the US, the TIAA, which is a pension fund that a lot of universities have pensions managed by this company. Used to be called TIAA-CREF, now it's only TIAA. TIAA is the largest company buying land, speculating with farmland in the world, and it receives funds also from pension funds in other countries. So this is a key player, and TIAA has an image of being progressive because it manages a lot of the university pension funds and NGOs as well. So I think, pressuring them is also a good type of advocacy work.
I know some people are asking for a list of these companies that you listed. In a moment, we're going to list your website. Would they be able to find information about those companies on your website?
Yes, we have several reports in English. If you go to reports in English, we have several reports about that.
Okay, great. Mauricio, you talked about, it's a question, you talked about the need for pastoral conversion to let go of church structures that are no longer serving and to be open to new ways of being an authentic church of inclusion. What are new ways of being church that do you think are needed, and how do you see this emerging?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, not to be afraid of the changes, to understand that this is part of our identity. The Ecclesia Semper Reformanda, an ever-changing church. This is how it's meant to be. And especially from 55, 60 years ago, Vatican Council II, there were a number of appeals and definitions and reforms that have not taken place yet as to respond to the more urgent cries of the people. The Latin American church did a very serious discernment process, perhaps because the reality was so harsh that required a different response. And yes, in some places it was too excessive, I would say, but it doesn't change the fact that it is deeply connected and rooted in the gospel and how Jesus would respond to the reality of today. So I think this is important. So the discernment of the signs of the times needs to be an essential feature of what it means to be a part of the church. And the social commitment is one of the essential non-negotiable elements offer our identity to our church today. We definitely must embrace this social commitment because it is part of our church. I've seen a lot of people rejecting Laudato Si's invitations and orientations. And I say, as much as we defend the doctrine of the church, the teaching of the church for other reasons, and I have to also second that, we need to do the same with Laudato Si. It is not an option. Laudato Si is just as important as part of the social teaching as any other teaching of the church. There is no choice. If you want to call yourself a Christian today, you must embrace the commitment Laudato Si represents in terms of conversion, integral ecology, and direct response to reality. So I again insist, it is not about taking down what the church means, but really rooted on the essentials, responding to the signs of the times. And this is part of doctrine. And Pope Francis is, again, we are not only centering our attention in Pope Francis, what he's doing in a very courageous way is he's bringing back all of those elements that needed to be put forward and couldn't be done. As you may have noticed, we were attacked all throughout the synod process, saying that we were somehow failing to respect the identity of the church and that we were going against the orthodoxy of the church. But what we know for sure, and as Maria Luisa was mentioning, we know there was big money behind that. It was not about sacraments, because there is a clear respect for that. It was not about the commitment of the church with indigenous peoples. It was about the threat that Pope Francis represents for the big interests which want to continue destroying the earth. But the earth can no longer resist, and indigenous peoples also are under such threat that today, for us, being with Christ is being with the crucified of our times. And those are all over the place, unfortunately. So I think the reform is just to ever grow in the dynamic of responding to the concrete cries of the reality and discovering Christ and also respecting our structures, but changing what's possible to change. Because the church is also, as I said, semper reformanda, always under reform.
Really just a couple of final questions, but could you talk about Amazon Watch? And we know that there are indigenous groups that want to prohibit anyone from entering their territories because of the pandemic. Is this impacting REPAM? And then finally, really, if you're speaking to people from all across the United States, what is it we as consumers, as members of our church, what would you ask us to do first? Mauricio.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. I think, again, the social teaching of the church in terms of ecology is right there for us in Laudato Si, and it's not optional. So it does connect directly with the Amazon. And if you see the whole synod, the Pope called this synod a son of Laudato Si. So what he's saying is that the root of this transformation is actually there in Laudato Si. The single most important category that we've been given as Catholic Church in the recent years is integral ecology. And what's very beautiful about it is that it didn't come from our own church dynamics. It is a result of the diversity, the cultural identities, different presences, and even science and social movements. And it was brought into the church to put it together with a long-standing tradition, which comes from also the Old Testament, all the way throughout the New Testament and Jesus's mission and the social teaching of today. So for us, this is really important to embrace, especially chapters 5 and 6. If you want to find out what to do, how to do it in my daily life, in my community life, in my society, and in terms of advocacy and politics, chapters 5 and 6 of Laudato Si are very clear, and they are a program, a concrete program for us. And in terms of the reality in the Amazon, it is important to understand the ethical decision of consumption, not only the how much I consume. What is the new society emerging after this pandemic in terms of also taking care of the balance of the ecosystems, but also where does that come from? Where does that come from, that beef, and what is?
Oh, we're losing Mauricio's signal a little bit. Maria Luisa, I'd like to ask you to the same question, if you could summarize, what is it that American consumers can do? What is it American Catholics can do? What's the #1 thing you would like us to come away with?
Yes, Amazon Watch is putting out a call for a moratorium of all business activities in the Amazon, mining, agribusiness, land speculation. Also, you know, some evangelical groups are trying to expose isolated indigenous communities, which is also very dangerous. So, you know, all these activities have huge impact in the Amazon, and we're calling a moratorium because most of these companies are multinational companies. Also calling your representatives to pass legislation boycotting these 4 products from Brazil: beef, timber, sugar, and soy. And also making sure that in the new Green Deal, that is also a role that the US Congress can play in terms of regulating transnational corporations and their destructive practices in other countries.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you both for your wonderful talk, and we really appreciate. We know we would probably go another hour with questions because people are putting them in the slides or in the chat room. But thank you so much. At this time, Anne-Marie, I'd like to give our participants a list of some suggested actions that we developed as a group of things that you can do to reduce or eliminate beef and leather products. That if you are going to, #2, buy wood products, that you should look for the FSC logo. That's a Forest Stewardship Council. That includes things like lumber, furniture, paper products, tissues, even clothing. That companies that have this symbol, that they have gone through scrutiny to know that they are not taking advantage of Amazon. #3, to challenge corporations to include biodiversity and sustainability in their policy planning, and to demand halt the use of palm oil in products which damage rainforests. If you don't know about palm oil, that's a whole other webinar, but it's in so many products, from food to shampoos, and so many different companies are using it. And what happens is their trees are getting cut down in the rainforest to plant these palms for palm oil, and it's creating more destruction. #4, participate in urgent action advocacy campaigns to support human rights in the Amazonia region. #5, to donate money to support land conservation and reforestation efforts in Amazonia. As has been discussed many times, the Amazon are the lungs of the earth, and that we must support this important region that is critical to our air that we breathe and the water that we drink. #6 is to pray for all the people and the natural life in Amazonia, and to encourage your church to regularly pray for this important cause. And then finally, please try to read Querida Amazonia from Pope Francis, and everything you can about the Synod. So, Anne-Marie, I think I'll send it back to you.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. Yeah, thank you also to Mauricio and Maria Luisa for your time and all this here. Here are your the websites for those of you who are interested in learning more about the specifics from REPPAM. There's the Spanish version there and the English version. And also for the Social Network for Justice and Human Rights, you can find their website there. And Maria Luisa had mentioned there are reports in English there where you can find more information about some of those businesses that you can write to. We also want to thank our sponsors. Christian Life Community, Global Catholic Climate Movement, the Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement. They have an email there if you have particular questions. And then the Church of St. Francis Xavier, in New York City, the Environment Ministry. We'll be making a recording of this, and in a couple of days, we hope to post it on the YouTube channel with St. Francis Xavier. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, that there are actually 2 webinars. Our second one is going to be on June 14th at 4 p.m. on Sunday, so we ask you to save the date for that. That's going to be in recognizing the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si, which Mauricio mentioned several times. The webinar will look at the impact of Pope Francis's encyclical, particularly on people of faith, and we'll look at recent calls for accelerating our actions in this time of urgency. Yes, so it's really, we're very grateful to all of you here. I'm going to stop sharing this here. Yeah, we're grateful to all of you for being part of this. And we pray that you and your families will stay well and be safe throughout. And we close with a quote from Pope Francis. In today's celebration of Earth Day, we are called to renew our sense of sacred respect for the earth. For it is not our home, just our home, but it's also God's home. This should make us all the more aware that we stand on holy ground. So thank you, everybody. Yeah, we had a good turnout here with over 140 people at one time. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Mauricio, Maria, Luisa. Wonderful information. I feel like people want to hear more about it. Maybe at some point we can find a way for collecting some of the questions also in the chat and then finding a way to distribute some answers. So thank you, everybody.